How shall I tell the story of these books? Because there are so many layers to it. Once in a while you come across a non-fiction book that gives you a new and very fresh perspective on a topic that you thought you knew. The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt is exactly such a book. I listened to it several times as an audiobook because it gives me so much new insights on a period of time that I find very fascinating. Because it tells the story of how the Renaissance started, and it does it in a way that I've never heard before. When we apply the functional book graph, then this book belongs to the category fish-eye perspective. It's not meant as a very practical book, but instead it gives you a general and very beautiful overview of how the medieval period started to transform into a new time that we now call the Renaissance. Remember, this is the time where the people in Europe started to think for themselves again, and where they started to free themselves from the dark times of dogmas and superstition that was very typical for the medieval period. This is not a boring factual history book. It is one of my favorite history books ever. I think there should be a rule that all history books should be as compelling as this one. The book is called The Swerve, and it's such a good name because a swerve refers to an unexpected or unpredicted movement or an abrupt change of direction. And it refers to a new way of thinking that slowly starts to appear at the end of the medieval period. Now, what created that swerve? Well, there were several things, but one very significant one was the reappearance of a book that was lost for more than 1,000 years. It is a poem that contains more than 7,000 verses and was called De Rerum Natura, or On the Nature of Things. So suddenly that book is back. In 1417 it was rediscovered in a monastic library, probably in Fulda, Germany, by a man called Poggio Bracciolini. Stay with me, it's a really cool story. You won't believe what's in that book. At the center of this book is the idea that the world consists of an infinite number of tiny particles that cannot be broken up, and that everything on this planet is made by the endless combination of these particles. And these particles were called atoms. In verse 525, for example, the author writes that everything is created out of atoms and void and nothing else. And this was written more than 2,000 years ago. When Poggio Bracciolini rediscovered the book, he copied it and he sends it to his friends in Italy, who continue to copy it. And in this way, these old ideas started to spread again. This is where the swerve starts to create momentum. Greenblatt shows that the spread of this poem had very far-reaching consequences, because suddenly there was not really a need anymore for a creator. No need for an afterlife, no need for a God that will take decisions for us. Additionally, according to this book, there were species before the human species, and there will be species after we are long gone. And there is so much more in this poem that we now consider as very modern ideas. These new ideas come of course in conflict with the religious thinking of the Christians and the Jews and others during the medieval period. So there is a clash in the making. The poem represented knowledge that suddenly came back to mankind from a very distant time. The book was written more than 2,000 years ago by a man called Titus Lucretius Carus. And this poem was based upon the ideas and thoughts of Epicurus, the Greek philosopher of an even earlier time. He lived in the 4th century BC. It consists of 7,400 verses written down in 6 books. It was of course as if an old knowledge was found back, as if it was reborn. Hence of course the word Renaissance. Now Greenblatt tells this story in his book so well, and it's a perfect example that shows that non-fiction books don't need to be boring. The book contains many layers and they come perfectly together. One layer of the story is about Poggio Bracciolini. He was a former scribe to the Pope John the 23rd, and he loses his job because the Pope was thrown into prison. And now this unemployed man decides to become a book hunter. Very cool idea. So on his horse he goes to monasteries all over Europe, often in very remote places, in search for books, hoping to find books in beautiful Latin, because the Latin in the medieval period was apparently not of good quality. The irony is that Poggio Braccolini did not mind very much about the content of the books. He was a devout Christian, so these pre-Christian books were not that important to him. He was after the Latin. And De Rerum Natura, or On the Nature of Things, was a poem in a beautiful Latin that he loved so much. So this book is like a Trojan horse. He releases it back into society because of its Latin, but this book contains ideas that in time will help to dismantle his entire world. The principles of Christianity and other religions will be fundamentally challenged by the ideas coming from this poem. So the clash of worldviews starts. Another layer in the book of Greenblatt is that he talks in a very interesting way how books were made. And also he talks about the large amount of books that were destroyed by fire, by water, or they were simply overwritten, or they were eaten by worms. He calls it the teeth of time. And also this part is very relevant to the story. Greenblatt gives us also some insights on how books were copied in the monasteries and how the monks were guarding their books and how difficult it was for Poggio Braccolini to get access to a library if he already succeeded to enter a monastery. By sharing historical facts and combining them with the real life of Poggio Braccolini and how he finds De Rerum Natura, Greenblatt tells a beautiful non-fiction story that really sticks. He also, of course, introduces us to the book De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, and to the influence that this book has had even far after the Renaissance. As I said, it is one of my favorite history books, and I also love to listen to the audiobook when I travel. And by the way, the audiobook that I have is narrated by a gentleman called Edoardo Ballerini, who has a very nice way of reading a book and a pleasant voice to listen to. And that makes the experience, of course, even better. So we have the Swerve, which belongs to the fish-eye perspective, and we have Lucretius' On the Nature of Things, which belongs to Gems of Insight. It is not a practical book, and it provides very specific information about the philosophy and thoughts and ideas of Epicurus. Now there's a third book that is not a non-fiction book, so it doesn't really have a place in a functional book graph. This book is called The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Now why do I put a novel in this threesome of books? Because with this story, Umberto Eco gives a feeling of how it could have been to live in this transitional period between the medieval time and the Renaissance. This story takes place in the beginning of the 14th century in a monastery, and it is a murder mystery. Now what is really cool in this story is that the main character uses very modern ways of thinking, like reasoning and deducting from facts to try and solve the murder mystery. So the main character is more like already a Renaissance person. While most of the other characters in this story, they believe in devils and in demons, and some of them even see the murder as the beginning of the end of times, of the apocalypse. So much more a medieval mindset. So again, a book with many layers. One layer is the murder mystery, another layer is this clash between the old way of thinking and the new way of thinking. Yet another layer is this famous debate between monks from the Dominican order and from the Franciscan order on the very fundamentals of the Christian belief. And yet another layer is all about a library and books. Everything in this story evolves around a very large and mysterious library for which the monastery where the murders takes place is very famous, but where only a very few people have access to it. Just like in The Swerve by Greenblatt, there are so-called lost books and forbidden books from a distant past, and they are key in trying to solve that murder mystery. And finally, there is another layer, and that's a little love story. Now, if you know why this book is called The Name of the Rose, then please let me know, because it took me really a long time to figure it out. And I'm really wondering if I'm the only one with that problem. The first time I came in contact with the story of The Name of the Rose was via the movie made in 1986, and it was fully based on the novel by Umberto Eco. The cast of this movie is phenomenal. There is Sean Connery and Ron Perlman and many other great actors. And the movie is really a very nice visual version of the book. Of course, there are some difference between them, naturally, but I really like how the story is told by these two different media. I have to admit, I'm a bit obsessed about this really good story. In the last 10 years, I read the book several times, and I must have watched the movie 5 times already or so. I also heard there is a remake of the movie in a television series. It was launched in 2019, but I haven't seen it yet. I'm sure I'm gonna look it up. So if you want to read 2 very cool stories, one is non-fiction, one is a novel, because you want to be better informed or have an idea of how it was during the transformational period between the medieval times and the Renaissances, then I really recommend The Swerve and The Name of the Rose. I think I understand The Name of the Rose now much better after I read The Swerve by Greenblatt. And if you want to be surprised and inspired by a book or a poem that is more than 2000 years old and full of very modern ideas, then On the Nature of Things by Lucretius is really something for you. As always, I'm looking forward to receiving your comments, your thoughts and your ideas. And if you know a book that would perfectly fit into this category, let me know. And if you're as obsessed about The Name of the Rose as I am, I'd love to have a chat with you. So, hope to see you again at the next episode of Bold Books and Bones. Bye.